I work with researchers in Australia, New Zealand, and now pretty much all around the world around impact, translation, and their grant writing, how to write this into their grants, how to measure their impact. And so what I want to talk about today is really just to share what's happening in Australia, because we've been through a ton of change really, really quickly. And so our whole research management sector, as well as our researchers, you call them scientists, I think, but the academics, essentially are struggling and wondering how they're going to grapple with all of this. And so I'm going to talk about what we're seeing in Australia with that. So we have a bit of a history, not just with the convicts, but we have a history in the impact space. And I'm sure many of you have heard about impact in the UK. Anyone not heard about impact in the UK? So that's kind of, we're sort of following them a little bit. Although we came up with the idea first and then they took it because we were smart enough to say we don't want to do it. But now they've done it, so we kind of have to go and do it. So that's kind of the story. More recently, in 2012, we ran a bit of a trial with 12 universities submitting case studies, because case studies are a great way to show impact. And everyone kind of went, oh, it's a bit hard, don't want to do that. So then it sort of got shelved. And then in 2015, our government, we had a change of government, the government commissioned a review to say, let's look at university funding, let's look at how we're giving them money and why we're giving them money and are they worth the investment? And of course that made everyone panic just a little. So there was a review, and that review suggested many things, one of which was let's do an assessment of the level of engagement and impact of all of our universities in Australia. So in 2016, our Australian Research Council, the ARC, they ran a pilot study of our impact and engagement assessment. It was a very small assessment. And through that, there was a lot of angst and people didn't really know what they were doing, but they cobbled it together. People were given just a few months' notice that they had to do this, to go back years to look at impact. And then, so that was 2017, they did the pilot, and then 6 months basically after that, 2018, they've done a full assessment, which I call the real pilot, as do many people in Australia, because it was a very small, very, very small assessment. The maximum number of case studies a university would put in was around 22 case studies. Now that's very different to the UK's experience, where it was 1 for every 10 research staff, right? So ours was very small. But we still had to undertake an assessment, and we didn't get any money for our assessment, so our case studies didn't give us any money or return. And yet people still did them. I couldn't believe that. So we in Australia now are looking really at prospective and retrospective impact. So we're looking at the assessment piece, which is what I just spoke about, and we're not sure if that'll continue. There's a few things going on. But we're also looking now at the front end of impact, so that planning for impact. Now, to give you a bit of context, I have been working in this space in Australia as a consultant for 5 years. And 5 years ago, it was pretty much me and crickets. Now it's really busy because people are starting to understand it. But I was talking about translation and people were saying, Tamika, no one cares about translation. What are you talking about? I say, but do you want to have an impact? And they go, yeah, we want to talk about impact, but we don't know anything about it. We don't need translation. What? So we came from a pretty low base. So we have an assessment process which is done for the National University Assessment, but just this year, very, very recently, our major health funder has introduced impact case studies as part of a researcher's track record when applying for a grant, which is huge. And you can imagine that researchers have kind of gone, I've never written like this, I have no idea, I've never had an impact, even though they've had wonderful impacts. And I worked personally with 90 researchers and writing their impact case studies for these grants. It was phenomenal, and it was really lovely to see how much impact we'd actually had in our country, but they didn't know how to express it. They didn't know what evidence looked like. They didn't know what an impact type was. So it's been very interesting. So we've seen that come into our medical funding. What we've also seen is asking for that pathway to impact in our funding as well, which is great because that's what I've been trying to get people to do for a long time. They just don't identify with the language. So we now have 2 definitions of impact. Only 5 minutes. Wow, it's going to be a little longer. So it's going to be as long as my trip here, but no. So we have 2 definitions, and the first one I'm going to show you here is the Australian Research Council's definition, which is the one they use for our assessment. So what they look at is impact beyond academia. So only impact on society or outside of the research. Now, you can imagine for a fundamental scientist applying for health research funding, that's a bit of a problem. Yeah. So luckily, our National Health and Medical Research Council came up with their own definition of impact for that purpose, which was really nice because it also included knowledge impact, meaning if your knowledge was used by a different discipline, if your knowledge was cited by another research group to get bigger funding or bigger groups, that was also considered to be an impact. And so we got to pull out all these different and new types of impacts for these groups. Things like writing a book chapter. So, there were people who said, I'm just a fundamental scientist. And I'd say, well, what have you done? I'd say, oh, well, I've done this and this. And then they'd write this little thing at the end of their bio about their book chapter. And I'd go, tell me more about the book chapter. And they'd say, oh, yeah, it's in this textbook. I say, okay, who uses the textbook? Oh, it's been rolled out amongst all schools, all high schools use it for, talk about impact, right? But they just didn't see it. They're like, oh, but I don't care about that. I don't really care about the chapter. That's nothing to my career. Like it is now. So it's been a big learning curve. So I want to share some of the sector insights. So really what it's been is we don't know what we don't know, right? And so the Australian research sector has kind of grappled with this. It's been obviously a very steep learning curve for everyone. Some universities have employed entire teams. So we did an assessment. I told you, maximum of 22 case studies for a university. One university employed a team of 5 people to do impact in the university for 22 case studies. That's crazy. Other universities are going, look, it'll go away. We're not going to really put anything into this right now, so let's just see what happens. And I can understand that because we have another election coming up. We pretty much know that the government will likely change. And what do governments love to do? Pull out everything that the other government did because they can. So I think people are waiting to see what's going to happen. So we're just waiting. And also there's a lot of confusion about what impact is. A lot of people still just grappling with it. Even our own funders don't understand, and you can see that from the way they word their questions in the grant applications. They're asking for impact and then they say, and tell us about your outputs, and then tell us about your outcomes. It's like, it's not a logical pathway. So it's quite frustrating. So some common questions that I get asked. A lot of people misunderstand what reach is compared to impact. The pathway, the fact that translation is even related to impact is a big one. Not valuing the user and not understanding the differences between an output, an outcome, and impact. And so I just want to go quickly through 5 common mistakes and questions that I get. So that, because I'm a teacher, that's what I do. I teach people about impact, so I can't come here and not actually share this with you. Even though you're probably across it, maybe I'll give you some different ways of thinking about it. So with the terminology, there's been a lot of focus for us on commercialization, and obviously there's sometimes that really serendipitous type of impact that happens, and it's just magic. It's like, yeah, it doesn't happen that way all the time. So with terminology, we still have this big thing around research publications, journal articles, citations, not understanding the translation and what it has to do. And as I said, there's the outcomes, outputs, that sort of language. Also, what a different impact type is, like what are those impact types? What are the indicators of that impact? And what are the evidence that I need to show that I had an impact? And how's it measured in different disciplines? So that's been a lot of the questions that are coming up around that terminology and the concepts. Not valuing user involvement. So that's another part of that pathway. So not really thinking about who's involved. And we love the terminology end user. Do you guys use end user? Yeah? So when we talk about an end user, and I'm talking to someone in a medical research sector, say, for example, they're thinking about the patient. What we have to teach them is to think about the next user, because you're not going to hand your research findings to the patient. You're going to find them to the next person, and that might be a hospital administrator, it might be a clinician, it might be a policymaker, or it might even just be another research team. But you have to hand it to the next user. So I like to use the analogy of passing the baton. Or do you say baton?
Baton.
I know. I did a webinar for the US and it was like, oh. So the baton. And everyone knows what happens if the person that you're passing that to doesn't know about it. They're going to drop it, right? So the next user needs to know what the baton looks like, They need to know what to do with it when you give it to them. Otherwise, you're not going to win any race. You're not going to have an impact. So it's a really nice way to think about who are you passing it to? Who's the next user of your work? And when I say that to researchers, if you're working with researchers, they kind of go, oh, it's like this weight lifted. Thank you. Okay. I'm getting...
You're going to want it.
Okay, so the third one. Look, I said 5, so you could count down if you're getting bored. You know, like, it's only got a couple to go. So the pathway to creating impact is the other thing that they're not really thinking about. So it's not just a thing that happens or that we measure. It's a process. And so there was a really great publication that came out actually from the UK, from Fast Track Impact, about the elements of successful pathways. And it really links into that, knowing where you're going. So what's the postcard destination? What's your vision for where you're going? Being specific around what it is you're doing. We see a lack of specificity often with this planning. Tailoring impact, different audiences, different impact types, different outputs that you're delivering to them. Understanding people. I could go into this really deeply, but I won't. But understanding people, building real connection is what we've seen a lot of people talking about today. Difference between outputs, outcomes, impacts. So again, that terminology. So, you know, really simply, the way that I put it is inputs are what you need, outputs are what you do and you deliver, your outcomes are the uptake or use of your output, and the impacts are the consequences of someone using your output. And reach versus impact. So still I get people saying, oh, but this many people came to my website, or this many people downloaded, or this many people use my app. So what? So reach is numbers. We don't care so much about numbers. It's important to have some idea of them, but it doesn't show impact. So we need to know if something was used or if something changed. So thinking about the change in or things that happen. And finally, before I get pulled off, there are 3 key elements that I always say to the researchers I work with, and even to the research administrators that I work with, if you're thinking about impact. Know why you're doing the research or the project. Work with the next users, and share knowledge in ways that are both useful and usable. They're the 3 things you have to remember. It's a complex world, but if you can remember those 3 things, that'll get you there. And that's me.